This is part 3 of the Evidence-Based Public Health Lecture, Appraise, Apply, and Assess. Here are the learning objectives for this lecture. We will detail the steps of evidence-based practice and discuss the differences between evidence-based medicine and evidence-based public health. So let's start with an example. The CDC and the National Center for Healthy Housing conducted a review of evidence on housing and health to identify interventions that demonstrated improvements in asthma control. Their review found strong evidence by examining other studies, such as this one by Crocker, that in-home interventions targeting more than one environmental trigger are effective in controlling asthma symptoms. So here's an example of published evidence going through 2 or 3 filters or examinations in order to be categorized. We'll take a look at how you will go through finding evidence and putting it through a filter to judge whether or not it can be used for your decision-making processes and initiatives. Every day, the news is filled with stories highlighting health issues. In 2011, the Business Insider ran the headline, "Cell phones may cause cancer." In the story, the reporter wrote that cell phones pose a significant risk of causing cancer, and that they are now labeled under the carcinogenic hazard, just like lead and chloroform. CNN's headline was a bit more restrained. "Cell phone use can increase possible cancer risk." One of the Economist editors shot back that this type of radiation can't possibly cause cancer. I wonder how many of the public stopped using their cell phones, or were skeptical and kept using them, or said, "I need to see the original report." The Business Insider does give a link to the original WHO report, but neither CNN nor The Economist describe the original research. We will discuss how to appraise the evidence and then look at the WHO report later on in this lecture. Stories like these remind us to evaluate information with a critical eye for validity, relevance, and application. A study needs to meet all of these criteria to successfully support decision-making. It's been estimated that 20% of published literature is scientifically sound, which leaves practitioners with the task of sorting the good from the invalid and ineffectual. Appraising the evidence involves asking 3 main questions. Is the research valid and sound? What outcomes can I expect if I implement this research? And will my target population be able to use this research? Each of these questions can be further broken down. For the question of, is the research valid and sound, we will consider what type of study or evidence is this? Is this the right method to answer that question? Are the methods clearly explained and appropriate? Were biases accounted for? Who funded this study, and are conflicts of interest detailed? The second criteria looks at the results. Did the intervention achieve the intended outcome? How precise were those results? Did other studies find similar results? Lastly, we want to consider how similar the population in the study is to the population you are considering using this evidence for. Can this evidence be applied to their issues? There are many study designs used to answer research questions, including experimental, observational, and other types, such as economic analyses. Then there are studies that build on the primary studies, such as systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and guidelines. The evidence pyramid shown here is a diagram that depicts types of research in order of the amount of data and reliability of that study design. This is not to say that studies at the top may have been done perfectly or without bias, or that the studies on lower levels were not appropriate. Once you have selected your question, you can then select the study design that best matches that question. From the table, you will notice that systematic reviews and meta-analyses are listed as the first study design to search for, followed by various types depending on the question. After selecting and finding a study, you will need to appraise it. Critical appraisal worksheets are checklists designed to match one study type that you can use to determine the risk of bias in that given study. Several organizations have developed these worksheets and provide them freely. Here is an example of a worksheet designed to determine risk of bias in systematic reviews called ROBUS. It consists of 3 phases. The first phase is to assess the relevance of the study to your own question by determining the review's research question. You will notice there are several frameworks listed to consider, including PICO for intervention questions. Second, ROBUS asks you to consider 4 different domains of potential bias within a review, including the study criteria, how those studies were identified, whether the studies were appraised and coded appropriately, and if the information was synthesized and analyzed correctly. This leads to the third phase of bringing it all together. Let's look at an example next. This is a systematic review on school-based programs for preventing violence. It's from the Cochrane Collaboration, which is considered the gold standard organization conducting hundreds of systematic reviews. The first phase of ROBUS asks you to consider the question the review is attempting to answer. Here, the review is looking at interventions, so it will start to fill in this form, considering the population and intervention the review is considering, plus the outcomes. We are not clear right now as to what the outcomes are, so we will need to read on further. Next, the first domain of ROBUS asks the reader to consider if the study eligibility was appropriate. By looking at the first part of the methods, we see that the study criteria was clearly described. If the descriptions are clearly described and appropriate, we would consider this review to be at low risk of bias for this domain. The second domain asks the reader to consider the identification and selection of studies. Were all appropriate resources searched? Were limits placed that would have prevented the reviewers from finding all relevant studies? Here we can see that the search is clearly described and is well done. One of your assigned readings was an article proposing a slightly different set of questions from the public health perspective. The authors wanted to make a more direct link between the relevance of the study to the policy issue being addressed. And so Heller came up with this framework called the Population Health Evidence Cycle, which he defines as ask, collect, understand, and use. The questions in the checklist are designed to assess the completeness and transferability as well as quality. They can also apply to a variety of study designs. From that article, you can see the checklist presented here. This is under the Use category. So we see that there are different questions depending on the type of study. Here we see cross-sectional, case control, and so on. So let's go back to our cell phone and cancer example. When you look at the actual report from WHO, here are some things to notice. In contradiction to the story from the Business Insider, it's not a significant risk. It says it's possibly carcinogenic and gives it a Group 2B classification. So first, we need to know exactly what that means. As you scroll through the report and you get to the definitions section, it states that Group 1 is considered carcinogenic, while Group 2B is considered possibly carcinogenic. Thinking back to our critical appraisal questions, we want to look at how they gathered the studies, which they base this conclusion on. They vaguely say evaluated the available literature, which is hundreds of articles, and a complete list and the report will be published in the Lancet. From this, we cannot tell what search strategy was used or what the inclusion-exclusion criteria was. Next, we look at how did they evaluate the quality. They said that the evidence was limited and inadequate to draw conclusions for other cancers. However, they did say it was strong enough for 2B. However, we simply don't have enough evidence from this report to conclude anything. As with all news reports and studies, people take from it what they want. But it is important not to jump to conclusions before weighing all of the evidence. The next step is to apply the evidence, considering the community's needs. Within the traditional evidence pyramid, randomized controlled trials are highly rated. However, for community-wide interventions, randomized controlled trials are impractical and expensive and do not take the context of the community into consideration. For community interventions, different study types, such as observational designs or surveillance data, may need to be utilized. In addition, contextual information such as local resources, community acceptance and involvement, cultural relevance, and sustainability of the intervention need to be considered. In clinical medicine, the three domains of evidence-based practice are the patient's values and needs, best evidence, and clinical expertise. In a similar way, public health practitioners balance everything together, considering the whole community's needs. The final step of EBPH is assessing the impact. In this way, you will think about, did these steps work? What other questions do you have? Each new question then starts the cycle again.